Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Clinical Trials of Schizophrenia, Optimizing Patient-Reported Outcomes and Performance Outcome Assessments. My name is Mira and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Cogstate and ERT who developed the content for this presentation. Cogstate is a leading neuroscience technology company optimizing brain health assessments to advance the development of new medicines and to enable earlier clinical insights in healthcare. Cogstate is a pioneer in commercializing rapid, reliable, and highly sensitive digital cognitive assessments and supports endpoint strategy and data quality programs for CNS assessments. ERT is a leading global provider of endpoint data capture technology for clinical research. ERT develops a wide range of products and services that increase the accuracy and reliability of endpoint data. These include centralized imaging, cardiac safety and respiratory data capture solutions, digital biomarkers, electronic clinical outcome assessment technology, and data reporting and analytics to support sponsors and CROs as they navigate the uncertainties of clinical trials. ERT and Cogstate have a strategic partnership to streamline the measurement of clinical outcome assessments for improved data quality, reduced patient and site burden, and enabled virtual trial conduct. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Chris Edgar is an experienced leader in cognitive assessment and clinical endpoint strategy who provides expert guidance to Cogstate's pharmaceutical customers throughout all stages of trial conduct, from study design and test selection through final analysis. Prior to joining Cogstate, Dr. Edgar oversaw clinical endpoint strategy for multiple neuroscience indications in patient-centered outcomes research group at Roche. He holds a PhD in psychopharmacology from Northumbria University, sorry about that, and has 20 years of pharmaceutical industry experience. Our next speaker is Jenny Lee, who is currently a senior clinical science advisor at ERT. She is a clinical psychologist with a specialization in neuropsychology and has over 10 years of experience in the design and management of clinical research. Dr. Lee has extensive experience consulting on best practices for COA design and implementation, as well as optimizing data quality through training for site raters, patients, and caregivers. She is proficient in assessing and working with patients with neurological and psychiatric disorders. She authorized over 15 manuscripts and taught statistical method courses. She obtained her PhD in clinical psychology from the Graduate Center City University of New York and a BA from Wellesley College. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our first speaker. You may begin when ready.
Okay, thank you so much, Mara, and thank you everyone for joining us today. There are 6 main topics that we will be covering in this webinar. First, I will be giving a brief overview of schizophrenia and some common clinical outcome assessments used in schizophrenia clinical trials, and specifically some of the advantages of using patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, and how they can supplement data from other types of measures. Then I'll discuss some commonly used PROs in studies that have examined the feasibility of using PROs in this patient population, both in paper and electronic format. Finally, I'll go over some considerations and best practices for implementing PROs electronically. After that, I'll be handing it over to Chris to discuss cognitive impairment as a central feature in schizophrenia and how cognitive assessments may be utilized across all phases of clinical development to address questions of pharmacodynamic, signal detection, efficacy, and safety and tolerability. Then Chris will go over the advantages of using computerized or ePROFRO assessments over traditional approaches. Okay, and before we just start our discussion, we want to hear from you about your experience using PROs and PerfOs. Mara, we're ready to launch the first poll question.
Thank you, Jenny. So, audience members, a poll question has just launched on your screens. You may answer this poll question in real time by selecting one of the following options right now on your screens. So, the question reads, what is your experience using PROs and PerfOs in schizophrenia clinical trials? Please select one of the following. Used in past study, using in current study, planning to use, evaluating, or no interest. Again, audience members, you may answer this poll question in real time by selecting one of the following answers. The question reads, what is your experience using PROs and PerfOs in schizophrenia clinical trials? Please select one of the following. Used in past study, using in current study, planning to use, evaluating, or no interest. I can see that the majority of people have voted on this polling question, so I'm going to go ahead and close it and share the results with you. The results read the following. 38% said planning to use, 25% said evaluating, 19% said used in past study, 13% said using in current study, and 6% said no interest. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mara. Okay, so just to begin, schizophrenia is a chronic mental disorder that affects 20 million people globally. So people with schizophrenia often experience symptoms that can be categorized into positive symptoms, including hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorders, as well as negative symptoms such as social withdrawal, flat affect, and apathy. People with schizophrenia may also have cognitive and functional impairment, which Chris will discuss in the second half of the presentation. As a result, schizophrenia has a large impact on health-related quality of life, the person's social and financial situations. So compared to the general population, people with schizophrenia generally have lower quality of life, poor health, and may have problems maintaining employment and performing activities of daily living. These problems are also present financial and social burdens for the patient as well as their caregivers. The most commonly used clinical assessments in schizophrenia clinical trials are clinician-reported outcome measures, or ClinROs. So for example, scales such as the PANS, the PSI-PANS, CGI, SCH are often used to assess symptoms, severity, and or changes in symptoms due to study medication. They are also often used as primary endpoints. Other scales, such as the CDSS, measures depressive symptoms, and the AIMS, MSAS, and the BARS are used to assess extrapyramidal symptoms. There are also a number of symptoms that are not easily observable to the clinician. So observer-reported outcome measures, such as the IQ PANS, are used to provide additional information about the patient's observable signs and symptoms, as well as their level of functioning in settings outside of the clinic. Other OBSROs, such as the SCQ, can be used to understand the impact of caring for a person with schizophrenia on the caregiver's quality of life. The two other types of COAs are patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, and performance outcome measures, or PerfOs. And they're being increasingly used in secondary and exploratory endpoints in clinical trials to complement data collected through other sources. And we'll spend the remaining parts of the webinar discussing PROs and PerfOs. Patient-reported outcome measures are instruments, scales, questionnaires that assess, for example, how patients feel, their symptoms, the effects of treatment, their overall health, their functioning in daily life, their quality of life, their mood, such as anxiety and depression. These responses come directly from the patients without interpretation by clinicians, caregivers, or anyone else. So there's a number of advantages of using PROs. Now, the data can help us understand the patient's experience with the disease and treatment better, because patients have expressed that capturing symptoms alone is not enough. The PROs can provide a more complete assessment of the treatment effect and complement other data gathered either from ClinROs, OBSROs, as well as physiological data. We can evaluate the effectiveness of treatment from the patient's perspective. And the data can also help us understand the impact of the disease and treatment on areas that are of significant concern for the patient, such as their overall health, their daily functioning, and their quality of life. Now, because responses come directly from patients, there's less clinician bias and rater variability from the site personnel. Regulatory agencies have also put forth guidelines using PROs in support of labeling claims. These agencies have also recommended the use of PROs when collecting data on concepts that are best known by patients or best measured from a patient's perspective. And PROs have been accepted and used in many different indications. However, there's still hesitations and concerns using PROs with patients with schizophrenia because of cognitive impairment and reduced insight in this patient population, especially on self-reports of psychosis. Now, some researchers have found that the reliability of self-report can be low, even when scales are re-administered immediately after each other. And they've also led to the researchers to state that self-reports or the results from self-report should be interpreted with caution. So now let's discuss the types of PROs that are commonly used in schizophrenia trials, as well as studies that show the feasibility of using them. The first type of PROs that's commonly used are health-related quality of life assessments, such as the EQ-5D and the FS-36, which are not disease-specific. The SQLS is specific for patients with schizophrenia. PROs are often used to assess treatment benefits and side effects, as well as treatment satisfaction, such as the medication satisfaction questionnaire. PROs can also provide information about the patient's symptoms on a more frequent basis with a shorter recall period if they're administered at home. Now I want to go over with you some published studies that looked at the feasibility of using PROs administered on paper in multi-centered clinical trials. So Danda and his colleagues examined the effects of risperidone using PROs to collect data on healthcare-related QOLs, as well as subjective well-being, treatment satisfaction, and medication preferences using the EQ5D, SF36, the MSQ, and preference for medication questionnaires. The PROs were administered during site visits at various time points over 52 weeks. They were able to conclude that a large portion of the patients were satisfied with the treatment and have had improved health-related quality of life. Another by Franklin and colleagues examined the construct validity of PROs compared with ClinROs. Now, specifically, they found that there was moderate construct validity with the EQ5D SF36, as well as the SQLS psychosocial subscales. They also found that there were consistency across the different measures. Now, again, these studies were administered they've administered the PROs using paper. What about electronic PROs? So electronic data capture also has many well-documented advantages over traditional pencil and paper methods of data collection. The use of electronic devices such as smartphones and tablets have become commonplace in our daily lives. So evidence from studies have suggested that many study participants have shown preference to using ePro technology. And the use of electronic data capture is recommended by regulatory agencies, including the FDA and EMA. Other advantages for using ePro includes reducing missing data from patients forgetting to fill out their PROs or accidentally skipping items. ePros provide time-stamped records of when the assessments were actually completed, ensuring that they were completed during the time window specified in the protocol, which leads to an increase in the actual study participant compliant rate. So in a classic paper by Stone and colleagues found that the actual compliance on paper diaries range from 11 to 20%, even though it was reported to be 90%, because of what is the parking lot syndrome, where participants will fill out their diaries and assessments right before the study visit. Whereas compliance for electronic diaries have been shown to be 90% or more. Other advantages include minimizing site and participant burden of working and storing paper diaries and then entering the data. It also eliminates data entry errors or being able to transfer participant data that are sometimes difficult to read or determine the responses that the patients have intended to select. Now, those are all advantages of using electronic implementations of PROs, and they have been used in many indications, but there's still hesitations using ePros with patients with schizophrenia. So we're going to now just take a look at some of the studies that have used ePros. In a study by Tolley and colleagues, they've assessed the feasibility of using eCOA with patients with schizophrenia and their caregivers using cognitive debriefing and usability interviews. So patients completed the SQLS, EQ5D, and the SF36, while their caregivers completed the schizophrenia caregiver questionnaire and caregiver global impression scale on a tablet. And what they found was that patients and caregivers were able to complete the PROs and OBSROs on tablet with minimal issues. They also stated that it was easy to use, and many indicated that they preferred using the electronic device over paper method. They also stated that they would not find it burdensome if they were asked to complete the PROs and OBSROs repeatedly over time. So this study demonstrated that patients can complete the PROs during site visits. But what about at home without the assistance of site personnel? So two studies have examined the use of ePROs at home. The first study, the researchers assess symptoms of medication withdrawal using the discontinuation symptoms checklist. And the patients completed the scale daily on a handheld device to identify potential drug withdrawal, which they didn't find evidence of. The researchers found that the patients had good compliance. So 86.2% of the patients were compliant during the open phase of the study, and 96% approximately of the patients across the two different treatment groups were compliant during the randomized withdrawal phase. A second study examined the feasibility and validity of using daily self-report of psychotic symptoms on smartphones. So here patients completed a questionnaire with items adapted from ClinROs, which included the PANS and the CDSS several times a day over a 7-day period. And the researchers found that 82% of the participants were compliant, and that the predictor of compliance was actually the positive subscale on the PANS. So in all, these studies have demonstrated that that it is feasible to use electronic PROs at home and at the sites during study visits. With that said, let's go over some best practices for implementing ePROs in a schizophrenia clinical trials. Now, many of these recommendations are applicable to different patient populations, but they're especially important when working with patients with schizophrenia. The first set of recommendations is to ensure that the features and the functionality of the ePRO device and systems are easy to use for the patient, and that they are presented in a clear manner with clear instructions. So, for example, each entry should be dated and time-stamped. There should be alarms and alerts to remind patients to complete their assessments. The ability to collect and save data on the device, even when there's no connectivity, is important to ensure that patients can continue to complete their assessments on schedule without any disruptions. And also important in this patient population is that each item of the assessment should be displayed one per screen, and that the button should be big enough to accommodate patients with extrapyramidal symptoms. And compliance report and site notifications are important tools for site personnel, especially when working with patients with schizophrenia, because frequent monitoring and contact with patients will help increase compliance. So the ability for site personnel to run compliance report in real time and to receive email notification for patients whose compliance dip below a certain rate will allow site personnel to contact, intervene, and help the patients as soon as possible. And the final set of recommendations we'll discuss is training. So training both site personnel and patients. So the training of site personnel is important for implementing ePRO data collection because site personnel not only interacts with the ePRO system throughout the trial, they are also responsible for training, guiding, and motivating study patients. So training topics to be included, but certainly not limited to how to use the device and electronic system, data transmission troubleshooting, how to use the ePRO platform to view and export data, run reports, and respond to alerts. Site personnel should also be given instructions on how to get technical support and whom they should contact if they have any questions about using the ePRO system. Study-specific training should also include the study protocol assessment schedule, so when and which PROs are going to be collected, how the PRO measures are used on the system itself. So for example, the software structure and the logic of the ePRO that is being implemented, such as branching and skipping logics, as well as how to resolve error messages. And most importantly, how to increase participant compliance through monitoring participant compliance regularly, and what to do if compliance fall below a accepted threshold. Now, patient training is also crucial in obtaining accurate data and high rates of compliance. So patients' experience with ePRO devices, as well as use of the handheld device, so smartphones and tablets, may vary. So training should be tailored to the patient's needs and comfort level, and that should be gauged by the site personnel. So training topics should include, and again, are not limited to, how to use the device, such as turning the device on and off, charging the device, how data is saved and transmitted, how to troubleshoot, how to contact the site if they have any questions or problems that may arise when they're using the device at home. And if they are completing the ePRO device at site personnel should also be nearby to assist them when they need to. And finally, training should help the patient understand the importance of their role in the study and how to complete their PRO measures on schedule. So those are just some recommendations and best practice for implementing using ePRO on either a handheld tablet or a handheld device or a tablet, either at home or at site visits. So that wraps up my discussion on ePROs. I'm now going to hand it over to Chris, who will discuss performance outcome measures, or PerfOs.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jenny. And I hope in this next section, the audience will note some clear overlap in the best practice for ePRO with those for ePerfO. So in this next section, then, the presentation will focus on performance outcome assessments, or PerfO assessments. And of course, as Jenny noted, with a focus on digital cognitive testing for clinical trials. What I'll briefly outline is the importance of cognition in schizophrenia, potential advantages of digital approaches to cognitive assessment, and then also some examples of the development and practical application of these kinds of tests. And just a quick note on terminology. So we might usually describe cognition assessments, cognitive tests used in clinical trials as neurocognitive or neuropsychological tests. However, when these are used as assessments to demonstrate treatment benefit, the use of clinical outcome assessment terminology can be applied, and they then become described as performance outcomes, which are task-based, and we use this PerfO terminology, which is becoming more widely used to describe different COA types. And for PerfOs, these can be based on physical task performance, e.g. mobility, cognitive task performance, as I'll describe, so things like working memory. They could also be sensory task performance, things like visual acuity, or other kinds of functional skills, such as instrumental activities of daily living. But also these digital cognitive tests can be utilized in other ways during clinical drug development as pharmacodynamic or early signal detection outcomes, and also to assess safety and tolerability and proof of concept, so beyond just use as an efficacy outcome. And in the following slides, then we'll touch on several of these different kinds of use cases. So in terms of people with schizophrenia, they may have cognitive impairments across multiple domains, including attention, processing speed, executive function, verbal fluency, verbal learning and memory, and working memory. And what we can see in this slide here is examples of individual test outcomes and composite outcomes from two cognitive test batteries that have been applied in schizophrenia. One of them, the MCCB, which I'll go on to describe briefly, and then also the Cogstate computerized battery. And you can see broadly similar patterns of impairment in schizophrenia patients when they're compared to healthy controls. In terms of the MCCB itself then, the April 2004 Matrix FDA NIMH workshop was held to develop guidelines for the design of clinical trials for cognitive enhancing drugs for people with schizophrenia. And a battery of cognitive PerfO assessments, the Matrix Consensus Cognitive Battery, or MCCB, was proposed as a co-primary endpoint for efficacy. And that's been accepted by FDA as a pivotal clinical trial outcome previously. And EMA in their guidance described the battery as acceptable, although other comparable test batteries may be used provided their validity is demonstrated. And so we find that inclusion of the MCCB, whilst frequent, is not universal in clinical trials in schizophrenia. And other neurocognitive test batteries, including the brief assessment of cognition in schizophrenia, the CANTAB battery, and also the Cogstate battery, which are all digital outcomes, are also commonly included in these kinds of trials. Another important element then to consider is the use of cognitive tests as safety and tolerability assessments. And much like we see with extrapyramidal symptoms, which are commonly evaluated using a series of motor examinations, the abnormal involuntary movement scale, the Barnes akathisia scale, and the Simpson Anger scale, the so-called Ames, Bars, and SAS. Cognitive assessments themselves may also be employed to evaluate potential side effects of treatment in people with schizophrenia. And historically, we've seen that the first generation antipsychotics have been thought to have some potential detrimental effects on cognition that could be occurring through a variety of actions, say at the D2, histamine, serotonin, muscarinic, and adrenergic receptors. But there's also evidence too that the atypical antipsychotics may be improving cognitive function in some people with schizophrenia. And then perhaps more recently, the potential for complex interactions between antipsychotics, cognition, and metabolic effects in schizophrenia has begun to emerge. And this has perhaps also caused a renewed focus on the cognitive consequences of anticholinergic treatment burden in people with schizophrenia. And so in this context, then, the potential for both improvement to cognition and worsening to cognition can be important to consider throughout drug development for schizophrenia treatments, or any medication that might be used in people with schizophrenia. So moving on to digital cognitive tests themselves then. Following the development of the Matrix Consensus Cognitive Battery, some significant concerns have been raised regarding patient and trial burden, and in particular related to the duration of the battery. So in a comparison study of the digital Cogstate battery versus the traditional Matrix battery, it's clear that the digital battery, whilst covering the same domains, it is substantially shorter, about 1/3 of the time to complete. And FDA have directly highlighted this issue of burden in their clinical outcome assessment development funding. And researchers involved in the Matrix initiative themselves have stated that the evaluation of computerized and digital tests was largely discounted at the time of the evaluation, but would certainly be a critical consideration for them now. So we see then that there can be advantages in terms of administration time for digital tests. But additionally, there are a number of other potential advantages of digital computerized and automated tools in general, in that they may require fewer staff resources in terms of training, administration, scoring, and data handling, and assessments can be fully automated in terms of administration and scoring, such that they don't require specialist neuropsychologist administration. In addition, there may also be some other benefits to this kind of automation, including rapid decision-making, ensuring test understanding for test participants, and also through the immediate application of inclusion-exclusion criteria based on cognitive test performance. So firstly, looking at that rapid decision-making, the ability to reduce or eliminate scoring and administration errors, the rapid identification and resolution of data discrepancies can support rapid decision-making, and that can be something that facilitates decision-making like dose escalation decisions in early phase development. Secondly, we know a key challenge with populations who have loss of insight and cognitive impairment, as well as psychiatric symptoms, can be in ensuring test understanding at the start of a trial. And by using algorithmic approaches, test completion and understanding criteria can be developed. What we can see in the right-hand panel of this slide is a set of criteria generated to determine acceptability, so understanding what constitutes test completion as a criterion, and then also understanding usability, so rules that help us understand that performance hasn't occurred with too many errors, such that it indicates poor understanding of the test, but also that participants are able to understand the test well in terms of the amount of time it's taking them to read the test instructions. And what we're then able to do in schizophrenia trials is to apply criteria like these to ensure the ability of patients to complete and understand tests prior to their entry into the trial, and provide an immediate decision post-test completion for the sites. Thirdly, then, recent data have suggested that inclusion criteria confirming some degree of cognitive impairment at trial entry may be important. So the idea being that some degree of cognitive impairment has to be present to be recoverable following treatment. And in the left-hand panel, we can see some data from the Karuna CAR-XT phase 2 trial, where in the overall population, there was no effect on cognition in terms of performance on the Cogstate battery composite. But when that data was analysed by tertiles, the group with the highest impairment then showed support for a positive effect of treatment with a fairly substantial effect size of 0.83. So then, in a similar manner to this idea of confirming test understanding, we can also set criteria for test performance to automatically flag for inclusion then trial participants with some pre-specified degree of cognitive impairment, and who may be more likely to then benefit from treatment. So now we come to our first poll question in this section, so I'll hand over to Mira for this.
Thank you so much. Audience members, a poll question has just launched on your screen. Again, you may answer this poll question in real time by selecting one of the following choices. So the question reads, what would you view as the most important applications of cognitive assessment for schizophrenia drug development? Please select one of the following. Demonstrating efficacy against cognitive impairment, ensuring drug doesn't contribute to cognitive impairment, ensuring drug doesn't impact development in adolescents, or early pharmacodynamic signal detection. Again, audience members, you may answer this question in real time right now by selecting one of the following answers. The question reads, what would you view as the most important applications of cognitive assessment for schizophrenia drug development? Please select one of the following. Demonstrating efficacy against cognitive impairment, ensuring drug doesn't contribute to cognitive impairment, ensuring drug doesn't impact development in adolescence, or early pharmacodynamic or signal detection. I can see that the majority of audience members have voted, so I will go ahead and close the polling question and share the results. The results show the following. 67% voted demonstrating efficacy against cognitive impairment, 29% voted ensuring drug doesn't contribute to cognitive impairment, and 5% voted early pharmacodynamic signal detection. Back to you.
Excellent, thank you, Mira. So clearly an audience with a majority focused on use of cognitive tests as efficacy outcomes, and we can try and reflect that a bit in the next section around practical application. And here we'll look at elements of fit for purpose development of assessments, as well as how they may be applied in the real world. And of course, for all types of clinical outcome assessment, ensuring measures are fit for purpose is critical. And as with traditional measures, digital tests should still demonstrate validity, reliability, and sensitivity to change in the planned context of use. And in establishing, firstly, content validity for efficacy outcomes, having a conceptual framework is an important first step. And that conceptual framework for the Cogstate schizophrenia battery and for efficacy outcomes in terms of cognitive impairment associated with schizophrenia comes from that developed by the NIMH Matrix Initiative, which identified these 7 cognitive domains. So the Cogstate schizophrenia battery then matches those same 7 domains in that conceptual framework, and these tests have demonstrated construct validity against the MCCB at both the test item and domain level. And in initial validation work, Peter, Zach and colleagues showed that the CSB was correlated with the MCCB in terms of the total scores, with a Pearson correlation of 0.83, but also that the 2 test batteries yielded comparable effect sizes in terms of known group validity, comparing people with schizophrenia to healthy controls. And also both tests were strongly correlated with function based on the UPSA performance-based skills assessment. Test-retest reliability and stability with repeated assessment in the absence of true change is, of course, another important metric property for clinical trials. And here we can see a study by Lees and colleagues, which has demonstrated adequate test-retest reliability for both the CSB and the MCCB in people with schizophrenia, in terms of the total scores from both assessments, and then additionally limited change with retest, so small effect sizes below 0.3. We have to recognize that test-retest reliability can present some challenges for us. It may be difficult to establish external criteria for no change in these samples, so a measure which helps us understand cognition isn't changing, given that cognition is subject to change over relatively short time frames and can be sensitive to factors like circadian effects over the day and sleep and fatigue, in addition to disease state. And we know too then that such estimates can be highly sample dependent as well as design dependent, so based on the frequency perhaps of assessment or the number of prior assessments. Given this, then it can be valuable to establish multiple estimates, and here we can see a number of demonstrations of adequate reliability across both healthy and clinical populations, and using different retest durations. And this kind of more comprehensive sampling and taking multiple samples can help us build up more of a picture of adequate reliability. And then a further consideration, of course, is the potential for participants and test supervisors to perform differently at the first administration because of unfamiliarity with tests or test materials, even assessment schedules and test settings, especially when this is early on in a clinical trial and there can be some degree of anxiety. So previous studies with the Cogstate schizophrenia battery have shown that these test familiarity effects may be minimized via the administration of a practice test prior to baseline, much as Jenny was describing for PRO assessments. And this can help ensure participants understand what it is that they're being asked to do, as well as being seen to improve test-retest reliability estimates. One of the ways that digital tests can support here, of course, is that we can generate algorithmically multiple alternate forms of the tests, and also automate their randomization in terms of presentation to study participants, and again help reduce any true practice effects that might occur within a study. Another key consideration for these kinds of tests, of course, as with any clinical outcome assessment, is translation and cultural adaptation. This may be made far easier with some kinds of cognitive tests because of the use of language-free stimuli, but certainly there are a number of studies that have been conducted to ensure that metric properties of the Cogstate schizophrenia battery are maintained in different populations. And it's certainly an important demonstration of the ability to easily translate and culturally adapt the assessments. A further consideration for us, of course, is that people with schizophrenia may demonstrate substantial heterogeneity in their clinical presentation. So we want to make sure that the tests have utility for different kinds of population within our population of people with schizophrenia. We've seen in post hoc analyses from the lorazepam development program published by Harvey and colleagues in 2017 that more severe insight and judgment impairments, so the G12 item from the PANS, can be associated with lower cognitive performance on the Cogstate battery, as well as functional performance on the UPSA. But additionally, this loss of insight is also associated with a higher probability of failure to complete the cognitive test or obtain a valid score. And so loss of insight and uncooperativeness may be particularly important to consider when we're thinking about cognitive assessment of people with schizophrenia. Certainly sensitivity to change is critical too, and prior proof of concept data are important in helping us understand the sensitivity of cognitive assessments. And as outlined, whilst there are no approved treatments currently for cognitive impairment associated with schizophrenia, we do know there's some evidence that atypical antipsychotics, modafinil, anticholinesterases might have a positive effect on cognition. And in addition, there's quite a consistent story for the D1 receptor as a therapeutic target. And we can see in this table a couple of examples here with amphetamine and the dopamine 1 receptor agonist, both showing clear signals for improved cognition in proof of concept trials. And additionally, recent phase 1 data for the D1 PAM, ASP 4345, have also shown a positive pharmacodynamic signal in people with schizophrenia on some of these same Cogstate tests. So there's a good weight of evidence here that may help us use proof of concept data, both to understand sensitivity to change, but also plan for other kinds of studies in terms of understanding effect size estimates and sample size estimates. Just to then close out with a couple of examples from the lorazepam development program. This first example is a demonstration of efficacy, and here we can see a publication by Harvey and colleagues which showed in a post hoc analysis of 292 patients completing a 6-week acute phase treatment and then enrolling in a 6-month double-blind continuation study and treated with lorazepam or quetiapine, that increased daytime sleepiness measured by the Epworth Sleepiness Scale was significantly associated with reduced cognitive performance on the Cogstate tests. However, lorazepam was able to significantly improve cognitive performance at 6 months in comparison to quetiapine, and with an effect size of 0.49. And this effect was still significant even after adjusting for the Epworth Sleepiness Scale scores, and still with a comparable effect size of 0.45. So it's certainly possible to demonstrate efficacy in these kinds of populations. And then too, in the lorazepam program, these same digital cognitive tests, albeit with a briefer battery, have been applied to evaluate cognition in adolescent patients treated with lurasidone, and in this case, patients between 13 and 17 years of age. And here in this study, there was no evidence for worsening of cognition observed over the 6-week study duration. And so this is evidence supporting the tolerability in respect of cognition in adolescent patients. So, although again, subsequently post hoc analyses have been presented, in particular by Pikolov and colleagues at the SIRS meeting in 2019. And these data are starting to suggest that there's improvement in cognitive performance, but closely associated with both C-reactive protein, so systemic inflammation, and also BMI at baseline, so in particular whether patients were overweight or obese. And so this is more data suggesting there may be an important interaction between cognition and metabolic effects and antipsychotic effects. So in conclusion here then, we can see that cognitive dysfunction is a central feature of schizophrenia, and drug treatments may need to be evaluated both for their ability to improve but also worsen cognitive function. Digital cognitive tests may have a number of important advantages over traditional in their practical application. But of course, as with all clinical assessments, these tests must be fit for purpose for the intended use case, and we should ensure they have utility for the planned trial and planned population, as well as established validity, reliability, and sensitivity to change. But with these criteria met, the test can provide important data that may support decision-making and insight generation in this area of drug development. So I'll stop there now and hand back to Mira.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Now I would like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions and comments right now using the questions window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I've already received some questions, so let's start with those. Our first question here today is, have patient-reported outcome assessments been used in large global clinical trials?
I can take that, Mira. So yes, so patient-reported outcome measures have been used in phase 2 and phase 3 of multi-site clinical trials. Some commonly used PROs include the EQ5D, SF36, and they are typically used as secondary or exploratory endpoints.
Thank you very much. Our next question is, can ePRO be used for more of the negative domains in PANS, P-A-N-S-S?
I can also take this one as well. So studies have suggested, so at least 2 studies have suggested that PROs might not be appropriate for assessing negative symptoms in schizophrenia because they didn't find construct validity between the PROs with the schizophrenia negative symptoms such as the PANS and the CGI negative subscales. So that it might not be appropriate to assess negative symptoms.
Thank you. Our next question is, has the Cogstate been utilized as a primary endpoint in a phase 2 or phase 3 trial? Has the FDA provided any comment on using computerized batteries for CIAS trials?
I can take that one. So the regulatory picture is a bit mixed. In terms of both FDA and EMA, they certainly appear open to considering alternatives to the matrix consensus battery. That requires early interaction and early dialogue. But certainly there are opportunities there to use alternates, and it's clear that FDA too are looking at a number of alternates to try and reduce patient and trial burden in general. So I think they're open to the conversation.
Thank you. Our next question is, what about internal reliability between subtests? How variable should we expect performance to be between, e.g. working memory and attention?
That might be one for me too. Although I'd love to have your opinion on this one as well, Jenny. My sense is that there's still a bit of a debate in the field about the extent to which we think about a general cognition G unitary type of construct versus thinking about cognitive tests tapping into quite individual and distinct domains. I suppose my bias is towards typically cognitive tests only being partially specific and tending to inevitably measure more than one cognitive domain, but of course two brain function not sitting in very discrete little boxes. And so we should to some extent expect intercorrelation between different items within a cognitive test battery, but I'd be less worried about a lack of interrelation in terms of internal consistency reliability than perhaps I would be with another COA type, which is intended to tap into a very well-established unitary underlying construct.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you accommodate for instruments that are administered by non-clinical staff, such as parents or caregivers, to avoid bias?
I guess that might be one for you, Jenny. I suppose that just as a quick comment, there have been some publications looking at the validity of PRO assessments when delivered as an interview, and of course we have a number of instruments that have proxy rated versions, and that's true of things like the EQ5D. I think it can be an option in certain disease states where we have a substantial concern about self-report, and so those kinds of options may be useful for certain groups within the schizophrenia population. But I'd be interested in your thoughts too, Jenny.
Yeah, just to further add that if we also need to have separate streams for audit purposes. So, for example, if the caregiver is completing a PRO, then so, for example, on device, they would need to log in and have a different password than the patient, so that the two different sources of information, so patients versus caregiver, can be separated and determined that way. So again, so proxy administration usually is not encouraged, and if possible, to use patient-reported outcomes that patients should complete those. But in certain cases, if that is not the case, then there definitely needs to be recording or a way to separate the two streams of information.
Thank you so much. We'll do one last question here, and it's, has Cogstate developed or experimented with modality-specific cognitive test batteries, e.g. auditory only or visual only?
So at present, the Cogstate tests present stimuli visually, although there are some limited auditory cues. But we haven't as yet attempted to focus on one modality and explore that uniquely.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. We've reached the end of the webinar. However, if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Cogstate or ERT may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, to please direct them to the email address that is now showing on your screen, businessdevelopment@cogstate.com. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in the chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of the event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me in thanking our speakers, Chris and Jenny, and we hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.